Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit, and you're watching a video from chesslessons.com. We're going to be seeing a series of opening traps, which are very well known, and are not only things that you should be aware of so that you yourself don't fall into them, which could be useful in some cases that your opponents could fall into them, but they also show a variety of tactical ideas which can be applied to not just the exact situation in the trap, but many similar situations. So this is very valuable, not just in its use for the repeating the exact trap, which, to be honest, is not going to happen too often. But these are things which you need to know, and these are concepts which are very useful and can make you a better chess player. So for our first one, we're going to see a trap which can happen, and happened in a game between a player named Gibaud and a player named Lazard in 1924. In this game, white began with d4, and black played the move knight f6. So we have a queen-pawn opening. Black has played a normal response, stopping white from making a pawn center by pushing the pawn next to it to e4. And here white played an unusual move, knight to d2. It's not a bad move yet. It has the disadvantage that it blocks the bishop from c1. However, this knight often goes there in a variety of queen-pawn setups, so it's not really to be criticized so much yet. Black responded very vigorously with the move e5, a sacrifice, at least a temporary sacrifice of a pawn. He wants to open up this bishop. He wants to destroy white's e-pawn. And the plan is to, once white takes on e5, to now begin attacking this pawn with the knights. White responded by taking, which is really what he should do, because at least to gain, even if he loses the pawn back, he will gain time attacking the black knight. Black responded with the move knight g4. You might, if you know a little bit about chess, you might recognize something similar to the Budapest gambit in this way of playing. However, this itself is not the Budapest gambit. And here white made a terrible mistake. He decided that, he figured he'll just give back his pawn on e5. And he decided to chase the black knight away, which was kind of an annoying piece. Maybe black wants to go bishop c5 and attack f2, or queen h4, or something like this. And he played the move h3. And here, black can take advantage of the weakening of this diagonal with a typical method, and he went with a crushing move, knight to e3. And this move won the game, and white resigned because the queen is under attack. It's trapped. And if white captures the knight, the only way to avoid having his queen captured, black will come down with the queen to h4. And this would check the king. White has only one way out of the check, which is to block. But that doesn't do any good because black will take this pawn and checkmate. So a great many opening traps, as we'll be seeing, are related to the weakness of this h4 to e1, or from black's point of view, h5 to e8 diagonals. The f-pawn moving on, the f-pawn being under attack, all of these things are very common themes in the opening. And a lot of the traps are revolved around that, but not all of them, obviously. We're going to be seeing quite a number more traps. Obviously, we won't be able to enumerate all the possible traps in chess, which is just enormous number, but we'll see a good many of typical ones which you might run across. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. Hello, this is Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. We're going to be seeing the second trap of our series. This trap took place in a game allegedly in 1620 by one of the earliest masters of chess, Gioacchino Greco, against an unknown opponent. I say allegedly because this game appeared in Greco's book, an ancient book on chess, one of the earliest books on chess. And it's been said that he most likely made up some of these games. Well, we don't know whether that's true or not. In any case, it doesn't really matter because this trap has definitely been carried out many times. And it's, again, we'll be seeing the concept of the weakness of the diagonal leading to the king, the h5 to e8 diagonal in this case. In our first trap, we saw the h4 to e1 diagonal. In this one, we'll be seeing the h5 to e8 diagonal. Okay, so this game began with the move e4, king-pawn opening. And Greco's opponent responded with b6, a somewhat risky defense known as the Queen's fianchetto defense, let's call it. Black would like to put pressure on White's pawns from the center, or from the distance. He allows White to establish a pawn center, but Black wants to attack that center from afar. And by doing this, he's putting his bishop on b7. This is known as fianchettoing his bishop, and putting pressure on e4 in a moment. However, this opening is rather risky, or rather rare, even compared to the modern defense, because it delays the development of the king side, which means it'll take longer to castle. So b6, Greco continued with d4, taking up his share of the center. Bishop b7, Black threatens the pawn on e4, and Greco responded by defending the pawn with bishop to d3. Now, you may be wondering why he didn't play knight c3. There is a general rule in chess in the opening that you should develop the knights before bishops. This is far from a frequently truthful rule, but this is still a rule that applies a lot. But here we see the reason is that Black is probably going to play e6, followed soon after by bishop to b4, which would pin the knight, which is guarding e4. In this way, Black can more easily put pressure on White's center by pinning the piece, which guards e4. By playing bishop to d3, White doesn't allow that possibility. Now, knight c3 is not necessarily a bad move, but this is more commonly played because Black doesn't get that possibility. And here, Greco's opponent played an extremely risky move. His opponent saw that this bishop is shooting along the long diagonal, attacking e4, and beyond that, even the g2 square. So he played the move f5, attacking this pawn from the side, and figuring that if the pawn moves, if it takes, in particular, if it takes on f5, he'll be taking on g2 with the bishop, which will trap the rook on h1. However, this seriously weakens the king along the h5 to e8 diagonal. This is a very weakening move, and it's very risky. More safe moves that Black might play are, for instance, e6, which prepares to develop this bishop in the future, and also prepares to strike back at the center, maybe by this move or by this move. Also, there is knight to c6, attacking this pawn, planning perhaps knight to b4 to try to trade off the bishop, and meeting c3 with e5, gaining some space in the center. But f5 was the move chosen by Greco's opponent. And now Greco indeed took on f5, allowing Black to capture g2. A very sharp move, White sacrificing material by playing this. Other moves would allow Black to achieve his goal and attacking White's center and trying to break up White's position. So White took on f5. Of course, Black must take on g2, or Black will have, knight f6, White will just continue developing, and White is up a pawn. And furthermore, it's hard to develop this bishop because this would result in very bad pawn structure for Black. This is just a terrible position. So Black really needs to use the fact that this long diagonal has opened up and take the pawn on g2. Now comes, the rook is trapped, but comes queen h5, checking the king here. Now if this pawn weren't here, Black could block with g6, and it would be no problem. Here Black has to block with g6, but it's a little bit different, because after g6, White can capture this pawn. And here, Greco's opponents made a natural move, but a fatal mistake. This has doubtless happened thousands of times in casual games. Greco's opponent played knight to f6, which attacks the queen, which is preparing to give a discovered check. And he probably expects g7, discovering a check on the king, attacking the rook, but then Black would take the queen. White would take the rook and make a new queen. But now Black will be able to eventually take this rook, and Black will probably move the knight back, something like this. But in any case, at some point, Black will take this rook and will stand quite all right. However, Greco surprised his opponent. Instead of playing g7, the natural move, which discovers an attack on the rook, preparing to capture a rook and make a new queen all at once, he played g takes h7 check. Instead, just creating a passed pawn which is fully blocked by the Black rook. However, Black's in check, and the only way out of check is to capture the queen. And here, I will give you the opportunity to pause the video and find the point of Greco's queen sacrifice. So pause the video now and look for the best move for white. Okay, that move is bishop to g6, and that's checkmate. Again, this diagonal, h5 to e8. It turns out to be a fatal weakness for black. Going back a couple moves, just for your information, instead of knight to f6, black needs to play bishop g7, making an escape square for the king. And after g takes h7 check, king f8, and it's a very sharp game, risky for black, but notice black will lose this knight, but black's also going to gain the white rook. Of course, he is also missing a lot of pawns, and his king is uncovered, so it's complicated. Now, stay tuned for the next trap. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit with ChessLessons.com. Today we'll be seeing a third trap. This is known as the Noah's Ark trap. This is a very common trap that can happen where a bishop gets stuck behind a wall of pawns. Just to show the basic form, first we'll be seeing this, which might happen in a Sicilian defense after, for instance, e4, c5. Let's say white plays knight to f3. So far, this is fine. The Sicilian defense covers the d4 square. Knight f3 develops the knight toward the center, maybe preparing d4. Let's say black plays knight to c6. Bishop to b5. Not a bad move either. Putting pressure on the knight, which covers the center squares, and developing a bishop. White's already ready to castle. a6. Now white should capture c6. However, let's suppose white decides they don't want to trade off the bishop. Well, they could retreat, but this would make this move kind of silly. But instead, let's suppose white tries to keep up the pressure here. This is a fatal mistake. This will lose the bishop, and it's called the Noah's Ark trap because the pawns will just... I don't know why it's called that actually, but it's going to, basically this bishop's going to be trapped. So now, black will play b5, attacking the bishop. The bishop will retreat, otherwise it will be captured. And now c4. And we can see that this bishop is just ensconced by the pawns. Nowhere for it to run. Black is going to capture the bishop. True, white will get one pawn for the bishop, but that's not going to be enough because the bishop is worth 3 points and the pawn is only worth 1. So this is a basic form of the Noah's Ark trap, but it can happen in many different ways. So let's be seeing something that happens more often, and in fact has happened in some serious tournaments. This is in the Spanish opening. After e4, e5, an open game, knight f3, attacking this pawn, knight c6, defending it, bishop to b5. This is called the Spanish. The bishop puts pressure on the knight. And now, let's suppose black goes a6, and white retreats. This is still okay. You can trade on c6, or you can retreat. There's no danger of black trapping the bishop yet, because after c5, bishop b3, there's no pawn to push to c4. The bishop is well placed here. So that's not, white hasn't made a mistake yet. d6. Now white plays a somewhat questionable move, immediately d4. It's better to either castle, completing your development, or play c3, for instance, which prepares to take over the center with d4. Those are both better moves, but d4. Now black might play b5, attacking the bishop, chasing it back, and the point is that now knight takes d4. Knight takes d4, white regains the pawn. Black takes back and regains the knight. And here, it looks natural to capture the pawn on d4, but that would be falling into a different permutation of a Noah's Ark trap. White should, rather than taking this pawn, maybe play a gambit by c3, for instance, and try to take advantage of the lead in development in this well-placed bishop. But if white captures the pawn back naturally, black goes c5, hitting the queen, and gaining tempo to complete the encirclement of white's bishop on b3. Now, it's not over yet. If white retreats the queen somewhere, the bishop is gone. Okay, the bishop is trapped, but white can play queen to d5. And it looks a little bit risky for black. Rook is under attack, and the pawn on f7 is also under attack. However, black can play bishop e6, attacking the queen, and if the queen retreats anywhere, even here, black can play c4 and then once again trap the bishop. Notice we're not trading off our bishop. We're going to trap the white bishop. It has nowhere to run and will be lost for just a pawn. The only way for white to keep things going and try not to lose the bishop is to play queen to c6 check. Now black would not like to block with the queen because this would lose the rook, and stepping up with the king would not only ruin the position of possibility of castling, but also allow white the time to get away with the bishop, trade it off, and they're not going to lose the bishop then. But black meets queen c6 check with bishop to d7, blocking the check and once again attacking the queen. So we keep handling white's threats with a gain of time. And finally, queen has to move. It doesn't really matter where, but regardless where it goes, okay, threatens checkmate, but then comes c4. And here, we had this position before and the rook was hanging, but here the rook is no longer hanging because the queen guards it. The bishop is simply trapped, and this is the Noah's Ark trap. The Noah's Ark trap is a well-known trap, and I've seen beginning players fall into it countless times, which basically means when you bring your bishop out over to the queen side and your opponent's pawns are advancing, you need to be very careful not to get your bishop trapped that way. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with ChessLessons.com. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit with ChessLessons.com, and you're going to see another trap. This refers to the Queen's Gambit accepted. This so-called gambit, as you know, perhaps, a gambit is when you sacrifice a pawn. You try to sacrifice a pawn you sacrifice a pawn to try to gain some sort of compensation. It can be various things: a lead in development, creation of weaknesses in your opponent's position, maybe exposing your opponent's king, taking over the center. But the Queen's Gambit actually is not a real gambit in most cases, because if white wants to, he can get the pawn back. So we are going to see in this video what kind of thing black can fall into if he is desperate to keep this pawn. So this is the Queen's Gambit. After d4, the queen pawn opening, black blocks the pawn and takes over the e4 square. c4, the Queen's Gambit. White is hoping to put pressure on this pawn. He wants to develop the knight behind the pawn to create additional strength in the center, rather than playing this move, which would leave this pawn out of the battle for the center. So c4 attempts to knock this pawn out. And let's say black falls for it and he wants to capture the pawn. Now this is not bad. This is the Queen's Gambit accepted. But we're going to see that generally black has to give back his pawn in the Queen's Gambit accepted and should not try to keep it under, should not be desperate to keep the pawn. Sometimes black can keep the pawn depending on how white plays, but if white wants to get the pawn back, black needs to give the pawn back. So e3 is the continuation here. It's not the only move for white. White can play other moves such as knight f3, but this is how the trap develops. This aims to capture the pawn with the bishop. So now, let's suppose black wants to keep the pawn. Really, black should just give the pawn back with such moves like knight to f6, followed by e6 and c5, and give the pawn back, but fight back in the center. But let's suppose black protects the pawn with his own pawn. Now, these pawns create a barrier to this bishop, and black has solidly defended the pawn which he just captured last move. However, it doesn't work out so well. This is what's known as a pawn chain. This pawn is guarded by that pawn. And there's a well-known principle that when there's a pawn chain and you want to break down a pawn chain, you should attack the base. It's the same principle as if you have a stack of blocks and you want to knock it down. You don't hit the top block, you hit the bottom block. And we're going to do that. We're going to attack this pawn. And the way to do it is to undermine it with one of white's pawns. You could attack it with a knight, for instance, but then it would be solidly defended by another pawn, and white would not achieve anything in knocking this pawn out. So instead, a4 undermines the pawn with white's own pawn. So if black wants to keep his extra pawn, he has to guard this pawn somehow. And a6 is not going to do that because white will capture, and black sees that capturing back would be bad because of rook takes a8, winning a rook. So this a-pawn is pinned, black would lose back one pawn and would be also likely to lose the pawn on c4. So a6 doesn't really cut it here. Guarding the pawn with a piece is going to allow white to just capture, and then this pawn on c4 is ultimately going to fall. It's too weak. It's isolated and doubled. If white wanted to, could even take it back immediately by doing this, attacking the bishop and the pawn, which is also attacked by this bishop. So black would not be able to keep the pawn in that case, or either after this move either. So protecting with any piece is not useful, including the queen. That's also not good for the same reasons. So if black is desperate to keep the pawn, he plays c6, creating another link in the chain. And here it looks like black has things under control. However, he's slowly leading the way to this rook getting exposed. And what happens is white captures the pawn. Black should not capture back, but if he doesn't, his whole plan has failed. White won the pawn back and will probably win this pawn and be up a pawn. So rather than being down a pawn, black tries to keep his extra pawn, still pawn up, but now there's going to be a tragedy that's going to come black's way. And I'll give you the chance to pause the video and look for the move which wins material for white. So pause the video. Okay, the move is queen to f3. And this rook is now trapped. So this is one instance where you can trap a rook in the corner, and black simply, after this simple one-move attack on a piece, has no way to save his material. He cannot block. Queen d5 obviously is not good because white captures, winning the queen, and more as well. And either way of blocking with the knight or bishop loses that piece. For instance, knight to c6, queen takes c6 check, and white wins the knight. Now this attacks the king and the rook. Black can save the rook by blocking the check, and the queen guards the rook. But after white retreats the queen somewhere, it's still a piece up. And a piece up is a lot as well. So this move, additionally, after bishop b7, this also loses the bishop, and yes, black can save the rook by playing knight to d7, but it's bishop up. So that's not good for black in either case. So here we can see that it's unguarded pieces. Unguarded pieces are something you need to watch out for, and this rook is unguarded at the start of the game. Usually the rooks don't get exposed so early on, but in this case it does, so that's something to watch out for. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. I want to ask you a question. When have you ever seen 3 knights on a chessboard? This is a rare occurrence, but it can happen, and perhaps you should think how it can happen. Well, there's only one way, and that's promoting a pawn. But here we're going to see an opening trap that leads to the creation of 3 knights on the chessboard after only 7 moves. It seems incredible, but it's true. This is known as the Lasker trap, and it takes place in the Albin counter gambit. The Albin counter gambit is a sub-variation of the Queen's Gambit. We've just seen Queen's Gambit in the previous trap, if you looked at that one. c4, white attacks black center. The Albin counter gambit involves the counterattack on d4. Black attempts to take the fight to white and sacrifices a pawn in return to gain space in the center. Here, white takes on e5, accepting the gambit. And now d4 is the point of the Albin counter gambit, gaining space and preventing the white knight from developing to its best square, leaving this pawn sort of hanging out there, blocking some of white's pieces, and maybe this pawn will be weak, and maybe black will be able to even win the pawn back. Now this opening has a questionable reputation, but not because of the move in the trap, which is e3. This move looks natural, attacking black's outpost, but it fails because of this nice variation, which happened many times. The best response to this is bishop to b4 check. If black doesn't play this, white would have managed to knock out black's strong pawn in the center, develop his pieces, and will have an extra pawn. But bishop to b4 check shows the weakness of white's position. White has to get out of check, and clearly king e2 is an ugly move. Black would just keep developing, for instance, and this is terrible. Black has more than enough compensation with white's king on e2. We're not worried about how many pawns we have in that case. Now, the only other reasonable moves are bishop to d2 or knight to d2. After knight to d2, black can happily take this pawn after white takes back. It's true that white has an extra pawn, but his structure is a mess. His structure is actually terrible. And black has a variety of things. He can just attack this pawn, and he'll clearly be able to win one of those pawns back sooner or later and leave white with a big weaknesses, with many weaknesses as well. So instead of knight to d2, bishop to d2. Now if black just takes on d2, the queen can take back. White's guarding the pawn on e3 with the queen, and it's helped white's development. This pawn is under attack, so black doesn't take on d2. Black instead makes a surprising move. Despite the fact that this bishop is under attack, he takes on e3. So again, if white captures back with the pawn, we have the same structure as before. It's also terrible for white. For instance, maybe bishop to c5, keeping that bishop and putting pressure. Or you can trade on d2, and eventually black is going to get this pawn back because it's doubled and isolated and very weak. There are no pawns that can support this pawn. Both of these pawns are isolated because they do not have pawns. They don't have neighboring pawns on the files next to them. So while that's the best option for white, it's not a reason. It's not he doesn't go into this variation hoping for that type of position. He's hoping that he'll clear out black's center pawn and create a good position for himself. So that requires him to take on b4 and call black's bluff. But it's not a bluff. Black now captures on f2 with check. Suddenly we see that the king can't capture on f2 because its job is to guard the queen. Black will capture the queen and be up a queen. So the king cannot take on f2, and the king instead steps up to e2. But still it looks okay for white, because if black captures this knight and makes a queen, which looks natural, white can trade queens and then recapture this queen. And here, white is not up a pawn anymore, but he has a good position here. That's two bishops for one thing, and has space and very good development. So this doesn't look bad for white, and that's not what black should do. Black has something far better. After the pawn takes and the king steps up. Also, it looks natural to play bishop g4 check. However, white can respond with knight f3, so this would be a skewer, checking the king and taking the queen behind it, except that white has a good response, knight f3. Well, it turns out that black has a far better move, and you've probably figured it out from the intro to the lesson. Black takes the knight, and instead of making a queen, black makes a knight. So we have 3 knights on the board after only 7 moves. Amazing. The white king is in check, but it has to keep guarding the queen, and if the rook takes, suddenly there's no knight to interpose on f3, and black can check on g4, skewering the queen. The king has to move away and lose the queen, so that would be a tragedy for white. And the only other move is king to e1, but here black is now up a piece and can win very easily. For instance, a good answer would be queen to h4 check. This would create, there's a slight danger of losing this knight, in which case white would get the piece back, but with correct play the knight's going to get out. In addition, white is in big trouble with his own king as well. So for instance, if white blocks the check with g3, then queen e4 checks the king and attacks the rook, so black wins even more material. Meanwhile, if king to d2, black can just keep developing with knight to c6, attacking this bishop, and white is in really bad shape. After the bishop moves, not only is white unlikely to get that bishop, but black can continue with bishop to g4, attacking the white queen. Next move, castle queenside, with a terrible attack and more pieces for black. So this has been the Lasker trap in the Albin counter gambit, an exciting kind of and creative kind of trap where there are 3 knights on the board at the start of the game. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com, and we're going to be seeing another interesting trap. This is sometimes called the Blackburn Shilling trap. It's named such because there's a player named Blackburn from quite a long time ago, and the legend says that he used this trap a lot to win shillings against amateurs in the cafes. Back then, well, Blackburn was a pretty decent player, one of the top players in the world, but back then there was a lot of chess was played in cafes for casual games for a little bit of money, and that's where this opening got its trap for its name. This trap got its name for it. This is contrary to some of the traps we've seen before, where basically the player setting the trap played correctly and the trap occurred naturally. This trap occurs after black makes a bluff, black makes a bad move, and white responds incorrectly. So this is not a trap that I suggest you try to catch people in. This occurs after e4, king-pawn opening, e5, countering the e-pawn, knight to f3, attacking the pawn, natural move, and black defends with knight c6. So far, both players are playing quite all right. Bishop b4, the Italian game. His bishop is aimed toward f7. It gets ready to castle. It fights for the center. And now the Blackburn shilling trap begins with a very questionable move, knight to d4. This move moves the piece a second time, which was already developed. Instead of playing this move, black should consider maybe bishop to c5. The Italian game, or the Gucco piano, is with bishop c5 generally, or knight f6, the two knights defense. And there are a couple other reasonable moves, but this move is really just a pure trap. And I want to spend a moment and talk about, do you want to set out at the beginning of a game trying to catch your opponent in a trap? And that answer is no. You should not be playing for traps. You should not, in general, play hope chess. You should not try to expect that your opponent's going to make a mistake. The only traps that are legitimate are ones that occur naturally in the game, when a player plays the best moves and takes into account the possibility of the opponent not falling into a trap. So this move sets a trap, but if white doesn't fall into it, it's going to turn out that this is a bad move. For instance, white could just capture that knight, and after pawn takes, black has moved this knight twice just to be traded off, and now white could attack this pawn, for instance, and if black trades that off, now we see that white's ahead with two pieces developed and black has none. Furthermore, white's about to take over control of the center and has two center pawns against one. These are all advantages which are long-term, and if you play well, it's going to help you to win the game. It's much more reliable to play for real advantages than just to set traps nonstop. But the trap occurs, of course, besides taking the knight, white could also castle, leaving this just hanging out there, and what's the purpose? Maybe white's going to take this pawn now. So, but the trap occurs if white goes and captures the e-pawn, seeing, oh, black left this pawn under attack, let me just capture a free center pawn. But it's not free in this case. It looks good at first. White gets the center pawn, removing the support of the knight, and is even threatening stuff on f7. White's aimed two pieces at the f7 square, which is a vulnerable square at the start of the game. He hopes to capture with the knight, forking the queen and the rook. However, black has a very strong answer. Queen to g5. This is a double attack of black's own. The knight is under attack, and the pawn on g2 is under attack. How is white going to meet this? If the knight just retreats to f3, for instance, then queen takes g2 is crushing, because this threatens the rook on h1 and the knight on f3. If white captures on d4, then black would capture on d1 and win material, and after king e2, could even capture again and then win the knight. So this is not good for white. Now going back, queen g5. What else can white do? There's no way to protect the knight. So in the trap, white goes knight takes f7, which is a natural move, forking the queen and the rook. The other possibility is if white checks on f7, but then after king e7, again the knight's under attack, and if the knight moves, this bishop can be captured as well. So this is also very bad for white. Knight takes f7. Black plays queen takes g2. So black attacks the rook in response to white attacking the bishop. And if white captures on h8, or rather in response to white attacking the rook, black attacks white's rook. If white captures on h8, then black can capture this rook, and this is very bad news for white. White's in check and has to block with this, and black can now capture this one, for instance. And after white blocks, then minimum black has a fork, knight takes c2, and capture that rook. So we're seeing lots of forks here in this position. However, white might try, after queen takes g2, going back, might try to just protect the rook and leave this rook trapped. And here's how it finishes. This is the cute end to the trap, which has happened many times. Queen takes e4. Okay, white's in check. If white blocks with the queen, he's going to lose the queen because the knight's going to capture it. So instead, white blocks with the bishop. But here, I'll once again give you the chance to pause the video and look for the best move for black. Now here, there are several good moves, but there's one that's by far the best, and I'm asking you to find that move. Okay, here, knight f3 is checkmate. The white king is under attack, it's a smothered checkmate, and the bishop cannot capture the knight because it's pinned. The queen would be attacking the white king. So that's checkmate. Now this shows an important principle in chess. You might have looked at this and seen knight takes c2. Well, this is not a bad move because this also checks the king. It has nowhere to run, so white would have to capture the queen, and black could capture back. But this is not checkmate, so the game goes on. It's better to just make the nice checkmating move rather than winning the queen. Same goes for some moves like taking the knight. Well, this is clearly not the best because black could have checkmated white. So this is the finish to the Blackburn-Schilling trap. This has been Grandmaster Brajan. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit with ChessLessons.com, and here we're going to be seeing a trap known as Legalsmate. Now this is a very famous pattern which occurs again as a result of a weakness of the f7 square at the beginning of the game. And sometimes we'll be seeing in some of these traps that there's the concept of the false pin is a frequent occurrence. A pin that player relies on too much. We tend to think of pins as being so strong when you pin a piece, but if that pin's not absolute, if it's, let's say, a knight pinned to a queen, that pin has the potential to be broken and even turned upside down sometimes when the knight moves out of the way and suddenly it's the queen attacking the bishop. So we'll be seeing that in this example, which is the basis of Legalsmate. Now Legal was a player from long ago, and this trap is named from him. Began with the move e4, e5, double king pawn opening, knight f3, d6. Now there's many different variations on this trap, but they all have this. They're pretty similar. They all more or less occur in the e4, e5 openings. Now bishop to c4. White brings out the bishop, aiming toward f7, and gets ready to potentially castle. So far, white is not doing anything wrong. Unlike the Blackburn-Schilling trap, white's not doing anything weird. White's not hoping that his opponent makes a mistake. Black just makes the mistake, and white takes advantage of it. So bishop c4, however, on its own right is a good move. d4 is more common, but there's nothing wrong with bishop to c4. Now, knight to c6, also an okay move. Black is bringing out the knight, and white now continues with knight to c3. Also a decent move on its own. The knight is developed toward the center. And here, bishop g4, which is a little bit questionable move. After this move, black is putting a pin on this knight, but an experienced player will know that with the bishop aimed at f7 and a knight on f3, the pin has a certain tactical vulnerability, and we'll be seeing that. Sometimes this can take the place of a capture on f7, and after the king takes, followed by a discovered attack, a check on the king, which discovers an attack. This tactic, however, in this position does not work because after knight to g5 check, the queen can capture, and suddenly black is just up two pieces, and it didn't work. But if we imagine that the queen was here, for instance, or here rather, this would work, okay? The knight would check the king and white would regain the piece. However, in this position it doesn't work. But this tactical theme is the basis of Legalsmate. white continues with h3. And now this is where black makes a fatal mistake. Trying to keep the pin, black makes a logical retreat bishop h5, saying, okay, you can break the pin by g4, but now the king side is permanently weakened. As we know, pawns cannot go backward. However, bishop h5 is a serious mistake for tactical reasons. And what black should do is either retreat the bishop somewhere or take on f3. Taking on f3 would give white two bishops a nice advantage, a better development, but it would not be fatal for black. Also, bishop retreating would make the move bishop g4 a little bit useless. h3 is a useful move for white, and now black won't be able to pin later on, but at least it doesn't lose the game. So bishop to h5 is how the trap goes. This is a mistake. And here, white has a beautiful way to take advantage of the unguarded position of the bishop. And that's by turning the pin upside down and capturing on e5 with a knight. An amazing move, because not only is that square on e5 guarded by the knight and the pawn, but white's also exposing his own queen to capture by the black bishop. However, there's a method to this madness. If black simply captures the knight with the pawn, we see that while white's move exposed his own queen, it also attacked black's bishop. And white would just win a pawn here and destroy black's position as well. Black has lost a pawn, and also white has two bishops on an open board. So this is bad for black. What else can black do after knight takes e5? Well, white's getting ready to take that bishop, so it's hard for black to find a whole lot. We're going to see what happens after he takes the queen, which is the most obvious. But what if the knight takes? Then would come queen takes h5, and white wins the pawn so far, just like before. And here, if black captures this bishop, we see that black's up a piece temporarily, but this knight is unguarded, and white has a nice fork, queen to b5, checking the king and capturing the knight next move. And white will end up, again, with an extra pawn. Now, does that mean the end of the game? Not really. Black could play on from here, but this is a big advantage to start off the game with. An extra pawn in the center for absolutely no compensation at all. A good player will manage to win this game. However, if black captures the queen, we'll see what happens is the whole point of Legal's mate. So black captures the queen. Says, okay, you can't move your knight, that's pinned. I'm going to capture the queen in response. But now, white manages to attack black with a few pieces. Bishop takes f7 check. The bishop's guarded by the knight. The king has to step up. He cannot go here because the knight is covering that square. Has to step up to e7. And now, the final move. Knight to d5, and this knight jumps in. We have the cavalry here, taking over control of all these squares on the 7th rank, as well as the f6 square. The bishop is covering e6, and everything around the black king is guarded, and nothing can capture the knight. So this is checkmate, and actually a kind of picturesque checkmate, I think. This is the basis of Legal's mate. So as we see, black had a chance to go and avoid the quick checkmate, but he would have a terrible position regardless, and now we see what happened if black called white's bluff and captured the queen. So this has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit, and you're watching a chesslessons.com video. Here we'll be seeing yet another opening trap. This is another trap on the theme of the false pin. A player who relies too much on the power of a pin when it's not an absolute pin. As I mentioned before, an absolute pin pins a piece to the king, and that piece legally cannot move. However, a relative pin, even if the piece is pinned to the queen, the piece can still move under certain circumstances, and a lot of times, a lot of traps are based on this concept, where the player overestimates the power of the pin. This pin takes place in a Cambridge Springs variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. So along with these traps, you're also learning some names of openings and a general introduction to some of the openings of chess. This begins with d4, queen pawn opening, d5, black blocks the pawn, c4. As we've seen before, this is the Queen's Gambit, and we saw the Queen's Gambit accepted, which is, as I pointed out, the Queen's Gambit is not a real gambit because black would come would come to disaster if he tries to keep the pawn under, just without any, if he tries to keep the pawn too hard. But here we'll be seeing Queen's Gambit declined, which is e6. This defense involves the pawn solidly defending the pawn on e5. Now if white captures the pawn, black maintains a strong pawn in the center of the board. Meanwhile, black is getting ready to possibly develop this bishop from f8. So white continues with knight to c3. This is a good move, bringing out the knight. Knight to f6. White puts some pressure on d5, and black answers by bringing out the knight and countering that pressure. And now bishop to g5, putting a pin on this knight. And here black has several moves, bishop e7 for instance, but in the Queen's Gambit declined Cambridge Spring variation, black plays knight b to d7. And the reasons for this move are a little bit complicated, but basically black wants to maintain the possibility of perhaps playing bishop b4. Black is preventing a future doubling of the pawns and preparing to bring the queen out this way. And this is the concept of the Cambridge Springs. However, you may wonder, well, white's attacking d5 by 2 pieces. Black's defending d5 by 2 pieces. But one of those pieces is pinned, so can't white take advantage of that? The knight on f6 is pinned. And this is a trap that has surely caught many people. White decides he wants to win the pawn on d5 and refute the Cambridge Springs variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, an opening which was played in some World Championship matches. So that would be misguided, but nevertheless, we'll see what happens when they try. White takes on d5. Okay, black takes back with the pawn. And here, white has not made any fatal mistake yet and could continue, for instance, by e3 or knight to f3, and the game goes on normally. But what if white tries to capture this pawn and says, okay, this knight is pinned, so I'll take the pawn. But this leads to a boomerang. Black captures the knight regardless, giving up his own queen. And after white captures the queen, now I'll give you the chance to pause the video and try to find the winning move for black. How black can punish white for his attempt to refute the Cambridge Springs variation. So pause the video and look for it, for black to play. Okay, the move is bishop to b4 check. And suddenly we see that white's king is in check. There's only one way out of it, and that's for white's queen to fall on its own sword. And here, black, in the end, we count up the pieces. Okay, you can capture the queen or even leave the bishop there and capture this because this queen's not running away, it's pinned. But in any case, at some point, black will capture the queen. White will capture back, black will capture the bishop, and we just count up the pieces. Black has 3 minor pieces, white only has 2. So white is losing. White has 1 pawn for the piece, but it's not enough, and a good player will easily guide this game to victory for black. So we've seen a very well-known trap in the Cambridge Springs variation of the Queen's Gambit. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with ChessLessons.com. Hello, this is Grandmaster Brajan Smit, and you are watching a ChessLessons.com video. Here we're going to be seeing a trap which happens a lot when people try to transfer the game into a dragon from a classical Sicilian. And white has played the move bishop c4 to prevent it. And this is based on a similar theme to Lasker's trap. The king has to guard the queen at the beginning of the game. So if the d-file can be opened up, the queens are opposed to each other, and the king can be diverted. And this is what happens in this trap. White begins with e4, and black plays a Sicilian defense. The Sicilian defense guards the d4 square with the pawn from the side. Now knight f3, d6. Black prepares to play knight f6 without allowing the e5 move, and also opens up a way for the bishop. d4, c takes d4. White plays d4, the open Sicilian, to gain space and gain some lead in development as well. White's development is going to generally be a little bit faster. On the other hand, black will have 2 pawns in the center against 1. White takes back with a knight, knight f6, attacking the e-pawn, knight c3, and now a natural developing move, knight c6. This is the classical Sicilian. And one of the ideas of the classical Sicilian is that after the quiet developing move, which is the old-fashioned move, bishop to e2, black can play g6 and go into the dragon variation while avoiding some different ways white can play if black did this g6 move on the last move. Here, white has various other ways he can play. But after knight c6, bishop e2, it's quite all right to go into the dragon here. However, bishop c4 Some people may try to get into the dragon anyway, but this is a bit of a mistake. And this eventually leads you, if you keep, it leads you into this, if you keep persisting, it leads you into this trap, which is fatal. This happens quite a few times. In fact, Lasker himself, in one of his world championship matches, came close to falling into this trap, although he ended up saving the game. At the last, he managed to avoid the trap at the last minute, we'll see, and save the game in the end, drawing the game. However, okay, g6 is not really the best move. Now what white does is white takes on c6. Normally not a move white plays in these type of positions, because after b takes c6, black's center is strengthened. But the idea is to follow up with this move e5. And this move attacks the knight, which causes black a problem, because white's ahead in development. And this ce5 square is guarded, and that's where the trap comes in, when black captures the pawn. If black captures the pawn, now I'll let you pause the video here. As I pointed out, that there's a basic tactical theme. The queens are opposed to each other. And how can white take advantage of that? You can pause the video and try to find the move for white. Okay, the move for white is bishop takes f7 check. As we can see, this black king is overworked. It has to guard the queen, and it has to guard the pawn on f7. So we're going to deflect it away from guarding the queen. It has no choice but to capture, and now comes queen takes d8. And black now loses. So this is the trap from the Sazin. Now, if black saw what was happening in advance, and after e5 decided to move the knight, obviously if he doesn't move the knight, he'll be down a knight, which is going to be enough to win. It would still be bad for black, but not as bad as in this. In the game, Lasker's World Championship match, I believe it was against Schlechter, but I'm not sure. After knight to g4, white played e6, breaking up the coordination between the bishop and the knight. Now white threatens to take the knight. And after f5, white had a strong pawn here, and the position was rather difficult for black, but Lasker managed to hold on. White could also consider taking on d6 and follow up by castling when black's position is very exposed as well. Another thing black could do is play knight to h5, play queen f3, attacking this pawn, which is a little bit improvement because we force black to block this with this move e6. Other moves are very ugly, and this pawn is also hanging. If d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes d5, threatens both the pawn on f7 and the rook on a8, and it's very bad for black. So after e6, now g4. And here black's in big trouble. The knight has to retreat to g7, and then white could continue with knight to e4. And here, knight to f6 is a huge threat, and black's position is a disaster. After d5, for instance, knight to f6 check, and the king has to step up to e7, and then comes queen a3 check, and the black king is getting checkmated soon. Has nowhere to run and would have to just block with those moves, but that doesn't help. White will take them. And meanwhile, if black plays queen a5, there's a cute trap. Bishop to d2, queen takes e5, and now bishop to c3, and the queen is trapped. Nowhere to run. So here we've seen the Sazin trap, which is basically that after d takes e5, bishop takes f7, and this is a similar tactical theme to what happened in the Lasker trap in the Albin counter gambit. Is the king, it's overworked guarding the f7 pawn and the queen, or in that case the f2 pawn and the queen. This has been Grandmaster Brajan Smit with chesslessons.com.